The frozen wind cut through Sienna Vincent's coat like 1,000 knives as she stumbled through the blinding white landscape, clutching the letter that had brought her halfway across the country to her chest. When her legs finally gave out and the world tilted sideways, she thought about how stupid she had been to trust words written by a stranger, and how her aunt had warned her that desperation made fools of even the smartest women. 3 cowboys on horseback spotted the dark shape against the pure white snow 2 hours later, just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Preston Irwin pulled his mare to a halt and dismounted before his companions could even process what they were seeing. He dropped to his knees beside the half-buried woman, his heart hammering against his ribs as he brushed the snow from her face. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark lashes frosted white and lips turning an alarming shade of blue. "She is alive," Preston called to his friends, pressing his fingers against the side of her neck to feel the weak flutter of her pulse. "Barely. Thomas, give me your coat. Marcus, ride back to town and tell Doc Henderson we are coming in fast." Marcus wheeled his horse around and took off at a gallop while Thomas dismounted and stripped off his heavy wool coat. Preston wrapped it around the woman, noting the way her fingers were curled protectively around something even in unconsciousness. He pried her frozen hand open gently and found a letter, the ink smudged but still legible in places. "What does it say?" Thomas asked, leaning over Preston's shoulder. Preston scanned the words quickly, his jaw tightening as he read. "It is an advertisement. Someone placed a notice in an eastern newspaper looking for a woman willing to come west. There is a name at the bottom." He looked up at Thomas, something unreadable flickering across his face. "My name." "What? You never placed any advertisement for a woman." "I know that." Preston folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his jacket before gathering the unconscious woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel how her whole body trembled with cold even through the layers of fabric between them. "Help me get her on my horse. We need to get her warm before she freezes to death out here." They rode hard toward Leavenworth, Kansas, with Preston holding the woman against his chest and urging his mare faster than was probably wise on the snow-packed road. The town materialized through the swirling snow like a mirage, its buildings hunched against the January wind that howled down from the north. Marcus had done his job well, because Doc Henderson was already standing outside his office with blankets and a worried expression when they arrived. "Bring her inside quickly," the doctor ordered, holding the door open. "How long was she out there?" "No way to know," Preston said, carrying his burden into the warm interior of the doctor's office. "We found her about 5 miles outside town, buried in a snowdrift near the old Miller homestead." Doc Henderson directed him to lay the woman on the examination table, then immediately began checking her vital signs while his wife Sarah heated water and gathered more blankets. Preston stood back, watching as the doctor worked with efficient, practiced movements. The woman's face was still pale, almost translucent, but some color was beginning to return to her cheeks now that she was out of the killing cold. "Will she make it?" Preston asked quietly. "Too early to say. She has severe hypothermia, and I will not know if there is frostbite damage until she warms up more." Doc Henderson looked at Preston over his spectacles. "You boys did good bringing her in when you did. Another hour and we would be having a very different conversation." Sarah Henderson brought a basin of lukewarm water and began carefully washing the snow and ice from the woman's hands and face. "Poor thing. What was she doing out there all alone?" Preston pulled the letter from his jacket and handed it to the doctor. "She was carrying this. Someone used my name to lure her out here." Doc Henderson read the letter, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is a marriage advertisement, Says here that Preston Irwin of Leavenworth, Kansas is seeking a respectable woman of good character to come west and become his wife. Offers to pay travel expenses and promises a good home and fair treatment. He looked up sharply. You did not write this. I swear on my mother's grave I have never seen that letter before today. Then someone is playing a dangerous game using your name. The doctor handed the letter back. The question is why? Preston stared down at the woman on the table, studying her features now that they were no longer hidden by snow and ice. She had a fine-boned face with a straight nose and a determined chin. Even unconscious and half-frozen, there was something striking about her. The question is who, he corrected. Who would do this and what were they trying to accomplish? The woman stirred, making a small sound of distress. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. Sarah Henderson stroked her forehead gently, making soothing sounds. Rest now, dear, you are safe. I will stay, Preston said suddenly. Until she wakes up. She came here because of my name, even if I did not invite her. That makes her my responsibility. Doc Henderson nodded slowly. Suit yourself. Sarah will bring you coffee. This might be a long wait. It was well past midnight when Sienna finally opened her eyes. Preston had been dozing in a chair beside the examination table, but some sixth sense brought him instantly awake when her breathing pattern changed. He leaned forward as her eyes moved beneath her lids, then slowly opened to reveal irises the color of storm clouds. Easy, he said softly as she tried to sit up. You are safe. You are in Leavenworth with Doc Henderson. Sienna blinked at him, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, rough from the cold. The letter. I had a letter. I have it. Preston pulled the folded paper from his pocket and held it up. Is this what you are looking for? She focused on the letter with an intensity that made something in Preston's chest tighten. You are him. Preston Irwin. I would have been too late, but the train was delayed by the storm, and then the stagecoach driver said it was too dangerous to go on. But I had already paid for the journey, and I had nowhere else to go, so I started walking and then. She trailed off, her brow furrowing. I fell. How did I get here? My friends and I found you in a snowdrift about 5 miles outside town. You nearly froze to death. Preston pulled his chair closer, studying her face. Miss, I need to tell you something important. I did not write that letter. I never placed any advertisement for a wife. Someone used my name, but it was not me. The color that had been returning to Sienna's face drained away again. What? I am sorry. I know that is not what you want to hear, but it is the truth. I have no idea who wrote that letter or why they used my name, but I swear to you it was not me. Sienna stared at him for a long moment, then turned her face away. Preston saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. Of course it was not real. I should have known. My aunt told me I was a fool to trust it, but I thought maybe, just maybe. She pressed her lips together hard, fighting for control. Hey. Preston reached out and gently turned her face back toward him. This is not your fault. Someone played a cruel trick and we are going to figure out who and why. But right now, you need to rest and get your strength back. Doc Henderson says you are lucky to be alive. Lucky? Sienna's laugh was bitter and broken. I spent my last dollar getting here. I have no money for a return ticket, no family to go back to, nothing. Some luck. Preston felt something shift inside his chest, some wall he had built carefully over the years developing a crack. What is your name? Sienna Vincent. Well, Miss Vincent, here is what is going to happen. You are going to stay with Doc Henderson and his wife until you are fully recovered. I'm going to pay for your room and board, and I am going to figure out who did this. Once we know what we are dealing with, we will decide what comes next. Fair enough. Sienna looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, and Preston saw a dozen emotions flicker through them before she finally nodded. Why would you help me? This is not your problem. Someone used my name to bring you here. That makes it my problem." Preston stood and settled his hat back on his head. "Get some rest, Miss Vincent. I will check on you tomorrow." He was at the door when her voice stopped him. "Mr. Irwin, thank you for finding me, for not just leaving me out there." Preston looked back at her, and something in his chest tightened again at the vulnerability in her expression. Any decent man would have done the same. Sleep now. Outside, the snow had stopped falling and the sky was beginning to clear. Preston stood on the doctor's porch and looked up at the stars emerging from behind the clouds. Someone in Leavenworth had written that letter and sent it east, using his name and his reputation. The question was who, and more importantly, why target him specifically? He thought about the woman inside, about how she had clung to that letter even when she was dying in the snow. What desperation drove someone to travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger? What had her life been like in the East that this had seemed like her best option? Preston shook his head and started walking toward his boarding house. Tomorrow he would start asking questions. Tonight he needed sleep and a clear head to think through this puzzle. But as he walked through the quiet streets of Leavenworth, he kept seeing Sienna Vincent's face in his mind. The way her eyes had dimmed when he told her the letter was a fraud. Something about her had gotten under his skin in the space of a few hours, and Preston had a feeling that his life had just gotten significantly more complicated. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Preston was up before sunrise, pulling on his warmest clothes and heading to the saloon where he knew the early morning coffee would be hot and strong. The bartender, an old-timer named Gus, was wiping down the bar when Preston walked in. "Heard you boys found a woman half frozen outside town yesterday," Gus said by way of greeting, pouring Preston a cup of thick black coffee. News traveled fast in a town the size of Leavenworth. Preston wrapped his hands around the warm mug and nodded. "We did. She is alive, thanks to Doc Henderson." "What was she doing out there?" Preston pulled out the letter and laid it on the bar. "Someone wrote this and sent it east, used my name to lure her here with promises of marriage." Gus picked up the letter and read it slowly, his weathered face creasing into a deep frown. "That is low, even for Leavenworth. You got any idea who might have done it?" "That is what I aim to find out. You know everyone in this town, Gus. Who would benefit from bringing a strange woman here under false pretenses? And why use my name specifically?" The bartender was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he thought. Finally, he shook his head. "Cannot think of anyone off the top of my head, but I will keep my ears open. People talk in saloons, especially when they have had a few drinks. If someone knows something, I will hear about it eventually." Preston thanked him and moved to a table in the corner, nursing his coffee and thinking. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make this happen. They had crafted a convincing letter, found a way to get it published in an Eastern newspaper, and used details about Preston that were accurate enough to be believable. That suggested someone who knew him, or at least knew of him. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air along with Sheriff Tom Garrett. The lawman spotted Preston and made his way over, his expression serious. "Heard about your excitement yesterday," Garrett said, pulling out a chair and sitting down uninvited. "Doc Henderson told me about the letter." "Let me see it." Preston handed over the letter and watched as the sheriff read it carefully. Garrett was a fair man, tough but honest, and Preston trusted his judgment more than most. "This is troubling," Garrett said finally. "Fraud, definitely. Possibly something worse depending on what the end game was. You think they meant to harm the girl, or was this about embarrassing you somehow?" "I have been asking myself the same question all night. I cannot see what anyone gains from this." If they wanted to hurt Miss Vincent specifically, why bring her all the way out here? There are easier ways to harm someone, and if they wanted to hurt me, why involve an innocent woman? Garrett drummed his fingers on the table. Maybe it is not about hurting anyone. Maybe someone is trying to manipulate one or both of you into a specific situation. Or maybe someone wanted to get this particular woman to Leavenworth for reasons we have not figured out yet. That thought had not occurred to Preston, and it opened up a whole new set of disturbing possibilities. You think someone has plans for Miss Vincent specifically? Too early to say. But I want to talk to her once Doc Henderson says she is up to it. Maybe she can shed some light on who might have sent that letter or why someone would target her. Preston agreed, though he felt a strange reluctance to expose Sienna to more questions and suspicion. She had been through enough already. But Garrett was right. They needed to understand the full picture if they were going to protect her and figure out who was behind this scheme. They walked to Doc Henderson's office together, finding Sarah Henderson in the front room organizing medical supplies. She smiled when she saw them, though there was concern in her eyes. She is awake and ate a good breakfast. Her color is much better today, though she is still weak. Doc says no permanent damage from the cold, thank the Lord. Can we talk to her? Garrett asked. I know she has been through an ordeal, but the sooner we get information, the better chance we have of figuring out what is going on. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Be gentle with her. She is putting on a brave face, but I can tell she is scared and heartbroken. Finding out that letter was a fraud hit her hard. She led them to the back room where Sienna was sitting up in bed, wearing one of Sarah's nightgowns and a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark hair fell loose around her face, and Preston noticed for the first time that it had hints of auburn when the light hit it right. She looked up when they entered, and her eyes went immediately to Preston before sliding to the sheriff with apprehension. Miss Vincent, this is Sheriff Tom Garrett, Preston said. He needs to ask you some questions about the letter and how you came to be in Leavenworth. Sienna nodded slowly. All right. Garrett pulled up a chair and sat down, his posture relaxed and unthreatening. Miss Vincent, I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me everything you can remember about receiving that letter. Where did you see it? Who gave it to you? Anything you can recall might help us figure out who is behind this. Sienna took a deep breath. I saw the advertisement in the Boston Evening Transcript about 2 months ago. It was in the personal notices section. I had been looking through the marriage advertisements because... She paused, color rising in her cheeks. My situation was difficult. I was working as a seamstress, barely making enough to pay rent on a tiny room. My aunt had taken me in after my parents died 3 years ago, but she remarried last year, and her new husband made it clear I was not welcome. I had nowhere else to go and no prospects for improving my situation. So you answered the advertisement, Garrett prompted gently. Yes. I wrote to the address given, which was a post office box here in Leavenworth. About 3 weeks later, I received a response. She looked at Preston. The letter said you were a rancher, that you had a good home and were looking for a sensible wife who was not afraid of hard work. It said you would send money for my travel expenses to the post office in Boston, and I should come as soon as I could arrange my affairs. And the money came. Garrett asked. Yes, $50 in cash, more than enough for the train ticket and stagecoach fare. The letter with the money said to arrive by January 15th, and to bring the original advertisement with me so you would know I was the right woman. Sienna looked down at her hands. I thought it was almost too good to be true, but the money was real, and I was so desperate to get out of Boston that I let myself believe it. Preston felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. She had been alone and afraid, with nowhere to turn, and someone had exploited that vulnerability for reasons still unknown. Did you tell anyone where you were going? My aunt. She tried to talk me out of it, said I was being foolish and trusting, but I had already made up my mind. I told my landlady I was leaving and a few of the other seamstresses I worked with, but I doubt any of them cared enough to follow up. Garrett leaned forward. This is important, Miss Vincent. In the weeks before you saw that advertisement, did anything unusual happen? Did anyone show particular interest in you or ask you questions about your circumstances? Sienna frowned, thinking. There was a man who came into the dress shop a few times. He said he was buying gifts for his wife, but he always seemed more interested in talking to me than looking at the merchandise. He asked a lot of questions about where I was from, whether I had family, what my plans were. I thought he was just being friendly, maybe a little forward, but nothing that seemed threatening. Can you describe him? Tall, maybe 40 years old, with light brown hair and blue eyes. He had a scar on his left hand, like a burn mark. And he spoke with an accent, not quite southern but not northern either. Somewhere in between. Preston and Garrett exchanged glances. That description could fit 100 men, but the scar was a distinctive detail that might help narrow things down. Anything else you remember about him? Garrett asked. He told me his name was William something. He said he was a merchant, that he traveled between cities buying and selling goods. But now that I think about it, I never saw him actually buy anything from the shop. He would browse and talk to me, then leave empty-handed. Did he know you were answering marriage advertisements? Sienna's eyes widened. I never told him that, but one time he saw me reading through the personal notices in the newspaper during my lunch break. He made a comment about how those advertisements were dangerous, that a woman could not trust what strangers wrote. I remember thinking it was odd that he felt so strongly about it. Preston felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. He was testing you, planting the seed that you should not trust those advertisements, maybe trying to gauge your reaction or see how desperate you were. But why? Sienna asked, her voice rising. What does any of this have to do with me? I am nobody, I have nothing. Why would someone go to all this trouble? That is what we are going to find out, Garrett said firmly. He stood and put on his hat. Miss Vincent, you are safe here with Doc Henderson and his wife. Preston and I are going to do everything we can to get to the bottom of this. In the meantime, do not go anywhere alone, and if you remember anything else about that man or anyone else who seemed unusually interested in you, tell us immediately. After the sheriff left, Preston lingered in the doorway. Sienna was staring at her hands, her expression troubled. He cleared his throat softly and she looked up. I meant what I said last night, Preston told her. I am going to figure this out, and I am going to make sure you are taken care of whatever happens. Why? Sienna asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. You do not know me. This is not your responsibility. Preston thought about that question. Why did he feel so responsible for this woman he had just met? It was more than just the use of his name, though that was part of it. There was something about her, about the quiet strength she showed even in the face of betrayal and disappointment, that drew him in. Let me just say that I do not like seeing people hurt, he said finally. And someone used me to hurt you. That makes it personal. Over the next few days, Preston divided his time between investigating the mysterious letter and visiting Sienna at Doc Henderson's office. She was recovering quickly, her natural resilience showing through as color returned to her face, and she began moving around more. Sarah Henderson had given her some spare clothes, and Preston noticed that even in a simple cotton dress too big for her frame, Sienna carried herself with a grace that suggested better circumstances in her past. Tell me about Boston, Preston said on the third day, sitting in the chair that had become his usual spot in her room. What was it like growing up there? Sienna looked up from the sewing Sarah had given her to keep her hands busy. Crowded. Noisy. My father was a clerk at a shipping company, and my mother took in laundry to help make ends meet. We were not rich, but we had enough. I was learning the piano before they died. She smiled sadly. That seems like another lifetime now. How did they die? Typhoid fever. It swept through our neighborhood one summer, and within 2 weeks they were both gone. I was 19 and suddenly alone. My mother's sister took me in, but she made it clear from the start that I was a burden. When she remarried, her husband said I had to either find a husband of my own or move out. So I found work as a seamstress and rented a room, but the pay was terrible, and I was always one missed week from being put out on the street. Preston felt anger kindle in his chest at the thought of her struggling alone with no one to help her. You must have been terrified. I was, but I was also determined not to end up in a workhouse or worse. When I saw that advertisement, it felt like a sign. A chance to start over somewhere new with someone who actually wanted me around. She looked away. I should have known better. You should have been able to trust that letter, Preston said firmly. The fault here is not yours. You were brave enough to take a chance on a better life. There is no shame in that. Their eyes met, and Preston felt something pass between them, some current of understanding and connection that made his breath catch. Sienna looked away first, color rising in her cheeks, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Sheriff Garrett came by that afternoon with news. I sent telegrams to several towns in the region asking if anyone knows a man matching the description Miss Vincent gave us. Got a response this morning from a sheriff in Independence, Missouri. Says there was a man fitting that description who ran a confidence scheme there about 6 months ago. Used the name William Carter, targeted vulnerable women, convinced them to invest in a fake business opportunity, and then disappeared with their money. So he is a professional swindler, Preston said. But what is his game here? Sienna did not have any money for him to steal. No, but you do, Garrett pointed out. You have a successful ranch property savings. Maybe the plan was to bring her here, have you feel obligated to help her, and then somehow use her to get to your money. Or maybe he is planning to show up pretending to be you, claim her as his bride, and then use her as a front for some other scheme. Preston frowned. That seems overly complicated. Confidence men think in complicated ways. It is how they stay ahead of the law. But here is the interesting part. The sheriff in Independence says William Carter disappeared after his scheme fell apart. Several victims filed complaints, but he vanished before they could arrest him. No one has seen him since. Until he showed up in Boston looking for Sienna, Preston finished. Maybe. Or maybe we are dealing with a different person entirely. I have got deputies asking around town, seeing if anyone has noticed strangers hanging about or asking questions about you or your property. If this Carter fellow or anyone connected to him is in Leavenworth, we will find him. That night, Preston could not sleep. He kept thinking about Sienna, alone in that snowstorm, clutching a fraudulent letter and believing she was walking toward a new life. The desperation it must have taken to leave everything behind and travel into the unknown made his chest ache. And now she was trapped here, with no money to leave and nowhere to go. The solution came to him around midnight, so obvious he wondered why he had not thought of it sooner. It was risky and unconventional, but then again, nothing about this situation was conventional. The next morning, Preston dressed carefully in his best clothes and made his way to Doc Henderson's office. He found Sienna in the kitchen with Sarah, helping to prepare breakfast. She looked up when he entered, and her smile made that crack in his chest widen into something that felt almost like a chasm. "Mr. Irwin, you are here early. I need to talk to you, privately, if that is all right." Sarah gave him a knowing look but shooed them into the sitting room and closed the door. Sienna sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with curious eyes. Preston paced for a moment, trying to figure out how to say what he had come to say. Finally, he stopped and faced her directly. "Miss Vincent, I have a proposal for you, and before you answer, I want you to hear me out completely." "All right," Sienna said slowly. "You came here expecting to marry someone named Preston Irwin. That someone turned out to be fictional, created by a criminal for reasons we still do not fully understand. But I am Preston Irwin, the real one. And I am saying that if you still want to get married, I am willing to make good on the promise that was made in your name." Sienna stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she managed, "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am. I know it is sudden, and I know you do not love me. I do not love you either, not yet. But I have spent the last few days getting to know you, and I think you are brave and strong and exactly the kind of woman who could build a good life out here. I have a ranch that is doing well, a house that is too big for one person, and I could use a partner. Not just a housekeeper or a cook, but a real partner, someone to share the work and the decisions and the future." "But you do not even know me," Sienna protested. "And I do not know you. What if we are completely unsuited to each other?" "That is possible," Preston admitted. "But arranged marriages work all the time, when both people are committed to making them work. We would be starting with more than most arranged marriages, because at least we have met and talked. I think we could build something real, given time and effort." Sienna stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. Preston watched her shoulders rise and fall as she took deep breaths, clearly trying to process what he was offering. "Why would you do this?" she asked without turning around. "You could have any woman in this town. Why tie yourself to someone who was foolish enough to fall for a fraudulent advertisement?" "Because I admire that you were willing to take a chance on something better. Because I have seen how you handle disappointment and fear with grace and courage. Because in the few days I have known you, I have enjoyed talking to you more than I have enjoyed talking to anyone in a long time." Preston moved closer, though he did not touch her. "And because I think the person who wrote that letter might have gotten the details wrong, but they were not wrong about one thing. I do need a wife. I have been alone too long, and my ranch is successful but empty. I want to build something that lasts, and I think you want that too." Sienna turned to face him, and Preston was startled to see tears sliding down her cheeks. "What if I cannot be what you need? What if I fail? Then we will figure it out together. I am not asking for perfection, Sienna. I am just asking for a chance." He held out his hand. "What do you say? Will you marry me?" She looked at his hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it. Her fingers were small and warm in his, and Preston felt that strange electricity again, that sense of connection. "Yes," Sienna whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 days later in Doc Henderson's sitting room, with Sarah and the doctor serving as witnesses and Sheriff Garrett giving his blessing. Sienna wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had altered to fit her, and Preston wore his Sunday suit. The local minister performed the ceremony, his voice solemn as he spoke about commitment and partnership and building a life together. When Preston slipped the ring onto Sienna's finger, a simple gold band he had bought from the town jeweler, her hand trembled slightly. But she looked him in the eye and spoke her vows clearly, promising to honor and cherish him for as long as they both lived. Preston made the same promises, meaning every word, even though his heart was hammering with uncertainty about what they were doing. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said, and Preston leaned in carefully, pressing his lips to Sienna's in a chaste, brief kiss that nevertheless sent heat rushing through his veins. When they pulled apart, Sienna was blushing furiously, and Preston felt his own face warming. This was his wife now. This woman he had known for less than a week was now legally bound to him for life. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. After the ceremony, they climbed into Preston's wagon for the journey to his ranch. The Irwin spread was about 8 miles outside of Leavenworth, nestled in a valley with good grazing land and a creek that ran year-round. Preston had built the house himself over the course of 2 years, adding rooms as he could afford the materials. It was simple but solid, built to withstand the harsh Kansas winters and the blazing summers. "It is not fancy," Preston said as they approached, suddenly nervous about what Sienna would think, "but it is well built and warm." Sienna looked at the house with wide eyes. "It is wonderful. Much bigger than I expected." Preston helped her down from the wagon and led her inside. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. Off to the sides were 2 bedrooms and a small study that Preston used for ranch business. "That is your room," Preston said, pointing to the larger of the 2 bedrooms. "I will take the smaller one. I want you to feel like this is your home, not like you are just a guest here." Sienna turned to him, surprise evident on her face. "We are not sharing a room." Preston felt heat creep up his neck. "I thought we should take things slow, get to know each other better before that part of our marriage." "But if you would prefer—" No, that is very considerate," Sienna said quickly, though Preston thought he saw something like disappointment flicker across her face before she hid it. "Taking things slow sounds wise." They spent the rest of the day settling Sienna in. Preston showed her around the house and the ranch buildings, introducing her to his 2 ranch hands, Daniel and Robert, who lived in a small bunkhouse about 100 yards from the main house. Both men were polite and respectful, though Preston caught them exchanging surprised glances when he explained that Sienna was his new wife. That night, they sat by the fire after dinner, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. Sienna was mending one of Preston's shirts, her fingers quick and sure with the needle, while Preston worked on repairing a leather harness. "Can I ask you something?" Sienna said suddenly. "Of course. Why did you never marry before? You are clearly successful and respected." "I cannot imagine you lacked for opportunities." Preston set down the harness and stared into the fire. "I was engaged once, about 5 years ago. Her name was Catherine. She was beautiful and cultured, the daughter of a wealthy merchant in town. Everyone said we were perfect for each other. What happened? She decided she did not want to be a rancher's wife. Too much work, too isolated, not enough society. She broke things off 2 weeks before the wedding and married a banker instead. They moved to St. Louis last I heard." Preston smiled without humor. "It taught me that pretty words and romantic feelings are not enough. You need someone who actually wants the life you can offer, not just the idea of it." "And you think I want this life?" Sienna asked softly. Preston looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the way firelight played across her features and the gentle curve of her mouth. "I think you are strong enough to build whatever life you choose. I hope you choose to build it here with me, but I understand if you eventually decide this is not what you want." Sienna set down her sewing and moved to sit beside him on the floor in front of the fire. "Preston, I need you to understand something. I did not come west just because I was desperate. I came because I wanted an adventure. I wanted to see what I could become if I was not trapped by the expectations and limitations of Boston society. That letter offered me a chance at something real and meaningful, and even though the letter was a fraud, the chance is still here. I chose to marry you, not because I had no other options, but because I believed you when you said we could build something together." "You really mean that?" Preston asked, his voice rough. "I do." Sienna reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I am scared. I will not pretend otherwise, but I am also excited. I feel like my real life is finally starting. Preston squeezed her hand, emotion tightening his throat. Thank you for giving me a chance, for giving us a chance. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to embers. When they finally said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Preston lay awake thinking about the woman sleeping just beyond the wall. His wife. The word still felt strange, but increasingly it also felt right. The next weeks fell into a rhythm. Preston taught Sienna about ranching, showing her how to care for the horses and cattle, how to read the weather and the land. She learned quickly, asking intelligent questions and throwing herself into the work with enthusiasm. In turn, she transformed the house, adding small touches that made it feel like a real home rather than just a place where a single man slept between long days of work. They grew closer through the everyday intimacy of shared meals and conversations, learning each other's habits and preferences. Preston discovered that Sienna hummed while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her. She learned that Preston liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint, and that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. But they still slept in separate rooms, and beyond holding hands occasionally or Preston's hand at the small of her back as they walked, they did not touch. It was like they were both waiting for something, some sign that it was time to move their relationship forward. That sign came about 6 weeks after their wedding, when Sheriff Garrett rode out to the ranch with news. Preston and Sienna were repairing a section of fence when they saw him coming up the road. "Sheriff," Preston called, setting down his tools. "What brings you out here?" Garrett dismounted and tipped his hat to Sienna before turning to Preston with a serious expression. "We found William Carter, or rather, his body. A trapper discovered it in the woods about 10 miles north of here. Looks like he froze to death around the same time we found Miss Vincent." "Well, Mrs. Irwin, I should say." Sienna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Preston put his arm around her shoulders instinctively, pulling her close. "You are certain it is him?" Preston asked. "Matches the description Miss Vincent gave us, including the burned scar on his left hand. Had papers on him with the name William Carter, along with some interesting correspondence." Garrett pulled out a folded letter and handed it to Preston. "This was in his pocket. I think you need to read it." Preston unfolded the letter, Sienna reading over his shoulder. It was addressed to someone named Marcus Thornton, and detailed a plan to use Sienna Vincent to gain access to Preston's ranch and assets. The idea was to bring her to Kansas, have Preston feel obligated to help her, and then either marry her himself while posing as Preston or use her presence to create some kind of legal claim on Preston's property. "Marcus Thornton," Preston said slowly. "That name sounds familiar." "It should," Garrett said grimly. "He is a lawyer who set up practice in Leavenworth about 4 months ago. Seemed legitimate enough, handled a few minor cases. But when we went to question him about his connection to Carter, we discovered he skipped town 3 days ago. Emptied his office and disappeared." "So Carter was working with Thornton," Sienna said, her voice shaking. "And the whole plan was to use me to steal from Preston. Looks that way. My guess is Carter was supposed to intercept you before you made it to town. Probably pose as Preston and take you to a fake ranch somewhere. Then Thornton would create false documents showing you as Preston's wife with legal rights to his property. They would have you sign things without understanding what you were signing, clean out everything they could, and disappear before anyone figured out what happened. But Carter froze to death before he could intercept her," Preston finished. "And we found her first." "Exactly. Once you actually married Miss Vincent legitimately, their entire scheme fell apart. Thornton must have realized he could not pull it off alone, so he cut his losses and ran. Garrett looked at Sienna with sympathy. "You were never the target, Mrs. Irwin. You were just a tool they planned to use." "I am sorry." After Garrett left, Preston and Sienna stood in silence, processing what they had learned. Finally, Sienna spoke, her voice small. "I am so sorry, Preston. I brought this danger to your door." "No." Preston turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "Carter and Thornton brought danger to my door. You were their victim just as much as I would have been. Maybe more, because they were willing to use you and probably dispose of you once you were no longer useful. You think Carter was really trying to intercept me that day? That he was out there in the storm looking for me, probably. And the storm got him before he could find you." Preston pulled her into a hug, feeling her tremble against him. "You are safe now. They are both gone, Carter dead and Thornton fled. It is over." Sienna clung to him, her face pressed against his chest. "I was so stupid. I should have seen through it." "You were not stupid. You were desperate and alone, and they took advantage of that. But you survived, and now you are here with me, and I swear I will never let anyone use you or hurt you like that again." She pulled back enough to look up at him, and Preston saw something shift in her expression. Her eyes were still wet with tears, but there was something else there now, something that made his pulse quicken. "Preston," she whispered, "kiss me. Really kiss me." He did not need to be asked twice. Preston cupped her face in his hands and lowered his mouth to hers, kissing her with all the pent-up longing and fear and relief that had been building since the day he found her in the snow. Sienna made a small sound and rose on her toes, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back with matching intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," Sienna said, laughing shakily. "Why did we wait so long? Because I did not want you to feel pressured. I wanted you to have time to be sure about this about us. I am sure." Sienna looked up at him with clear, certain eyes. "I love you, Preston Irwin. Somewhere between you finding me in that snowdrift and right now, I fell completely in love with you. And I think maybe you love me too." "I do," Preston said, the words coming easier than he expected. "I love you so much it terrifies me." When Garrett told us about Carter being out there in the storm, possibly hunting for you, I realized how close I came to losing you before I ever had you. That scared me more than anything has in years." They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the sun set over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Finally, Preston took Sienna's hand and led her back to the house. That night, she did not sleep in her own room. She slept in his arms where she belonged. The months that followed were the happiest of Preston's life. He and Sienna worked side by side on the ranch, building their business and their partnership. She proved to have a head for numbers and took over managing the books, finding ways to cut costs and increase efficiency that impressed Preston with their cleverness. Spring came to Kansas in a rush of green and wildflowers, and Sienna stood on the porch one morning with her hand pressed to her stomach, a secret smile on her face. When Preston came in from the morning chores, she turned to him with eyes shining. "I am pregnant," she said simply. Preston crossed the room in 3 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and demanded he put her down. "Truly, we are having a baby, truly. Doc Henderson confirmed it yesterday when I went into town. He says the baby should come in early November." Preston set her down gently and placed his hand over hers on her stomach, marveling at the life growing inside her. "I cannot believe it. We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Sienna asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Happy does not begin to cover it. I am thrilled. Terrified but thrilled, Preston kissed her softly. You have given me so much, Sienna. A home, a real home, purpose, love, and now a child. I feel like the luckiest man alive. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Sienna bloomed with health and happiness. Preston was attentive and protective, sometimes overly so, until Sienna had to remind him that women had been having babies since the dawn of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. In September, they received word that Sheriff Garrett had finally tracked down Marcus Thornton in California. The lawyer had been arrested trying to run the same scheme on a different victim and would face trial for fraud and conspiracy. Preston hoped the man spent a long time in prison thinking about the lives he had tried to destroy. November arrived with crisp air and the promise of winter. Sienna went into labor on a cold, clear night with stars blazing overhead. Sarah Henderson came to help with the delivery, along with Doc Henderson standing by in case of complications. Preston paced outside the bedroom door for hours, listening to Sienna's labored breathing and occasional cries of pain, feeling utterly helpless. Finally, as dawn was breaking over the plains, he heard a different cry, the thin, wavering wail of a newborn baby. Preston's knees went weak with relief, and he had to grab the door frame to steady himself. Sarah opened the door a moment later, her face beaming. You have a son, Preston. A healthy, beautiful son. Preston entered the room to find Sienna propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up as he approached, tears of joy streaming down her face. Meet your son, she whispered. Preston sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to study his father with intense concentration. Preston felt his heart expand in his chest until he thought it might burst. He is perfect, Preston managed, his voice thick with emotion. You are perfect. I do not know what I did to deserve this, but I will spend the rest of my life being grateful. They named him James, after Preston's father who had died when Preston was young. Little James was a good baby, calm and watchful, and he quickly became the center of their world. Preston found himself doing things he never imagined, like walking the floor at 2 in the morning singing lullabies and making funny faces to coax smiles from his son. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more chaotic than before, but infinitely richer. The ranch continued to prosper, and Preston hired another ranch hand to help with the increased work so he could spend more time with his family. One evening in early spring, when James was about 5 months old, Preston and Sienna sat on the porch watching the sunset while their son dozed in Sienna's arms. It had been more than a year since Preston found her in that snowdrift, clutching a fraudulent letter and nearly frozen to death. Do you ever think about what your life would be like if I had written that letter? Preston asked suddenly. If it had been real from the start. Sienna considered the question carefully. I think we would have ended up here, but by a more direct path. We would have missed all the fear and confusion and uncertainty. But I am not sure our relationship would be as strong. Going through all of that together, choosing each other even when we did not have to, that made us solid in a way I do not think we would be otherwise. So you are saying you are glad Carter was a fraud? I am saying I am glad I ended up with you, however it happened. The real you, not some idealized version from a letter. And I am glad you chose me for who I actually am, not for who you imagined I might be based on correspondence. Sienna leaned her head on his shoulder. We built something real, Preston, something that will last. Preston wrapped his arm around his wife and looked out over the land that was his legacy and his son's future. The sky was ablaze with color, the plains stretching endlessly toward the horizon. This life he had built, this family he had gained by accident and kept by choice, was more than he had ever dreamed of having. "I love you," he said, simple and true. "I love you too," Sienna replied, tilting her face up for a kiss. The years passed with the gentle inevitability of the seasons. James grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler, then into a bright boy who loved the ranch and followed Preston around like a shadow. 2 years after James was born, Sienna gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Grace, who brought even more laughter and chaos into the household. Preston expanded the house to accommodate their growing family, adding rooms and a larger kitchen where Sienna spent hours teaching their daughters to bake, while James helped Preston with the horses. The ranch thrived under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Sometimes, Preston would stand on the porch in the evening and watch his children playing in the yard, Sienna hanging laundry or tending her garden, and he would think about that day in the snow when he found her half frozen and clinging to a letter. How close they had come to never having this life, this love. When James turned 8, Preston took him aside and told him the story of how he had met Sienna, about the fraudulent letter and the snowstorm and the choice they had made to build a life together despite the strange circumstances. James listened with wide eyes, then looked at his father seriously. "So Mother came here to marry you, but you were not the one who invited her, and then you married her anyway?" the boy asked, working through the logic. "That is right. I could not let her come all that way and have nothing to show for it." "That was good of you, Papa. I am glad you found her." Preston ruffled his son's hair, his heart full. "So am I, son, so am I." By the time James was 10 and the twins were 8, the Irwin Ranch was known throughout Kansas as a model operation. Preston had become something of a local leader, someone other ranchers came to for advice and guidance. Sienna had started a small school on their property, teaching not just their own children but several others from neighboring ranches, believing strongly that education was the key to a better future. They celebrated their 10th anniversary with a party that brought the whole town out to the ranch. There was dancing and food and music, and Preston held Sienna close as they swayed to a fiddle tune under the stars. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Sienna asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday I found you in that snow. Other times, it feels like you have always been here, like I cannot remember what my life was like before you." "I know what you mean. Boston feels like a dream now, like something that happened to someone else. This is my real life, right here with you." Preston pulled back enough to look into her eyes, still as gray and stormy as the day he first saw them open in Doc Henderson's office. "I would do it all again. Every moment of fear and uncertainty and confusion. It was all worth it to end up here with you." "I said I am the man you were seeking," Preston whispered, echoing words he had never actually said but somehow seemed to fit the moment anyway. Sienna smiled, understanding the sentiment. "You are. You were always the one I was looking for, even when I did not know it." They danced until the musicians were too tired to play anymore, until their children had fallen asleep on blankets spread in the grass, until the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew deep and cold. Then Preston carried Sienna into their house, into the home they had built together from nothing but determination and hope and love. Life continued its forward march, bringing both joys and sorrows. Doc Henderson passed away peacefully in his sleep when James was 12, and Sarah moved to live with her daughter in St. Louis. Sheriff Garrett retired and was replaced by a younger man, though Garrett and his wife remained close friends with the Irwins. Daniel and Robert eventually married and started families of their own, their children growing up alongside the Irwin children. When James turned 18, He announced his intention to stay on the ranch and help Preston run it, having no desire to seek his fortune elsewhere. The twins, now 16 and full of spirit, had different ambitions. Emma wanted to be a teacher like her mother, while Grace dreamed of becoming a doctor, inspired by stories of Doc Henderson that Sarah had told. Preston supported all their dreams, knowing that the greatest gift he could give his children was the freedom to choose their own paths. He and Sienna had built a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love and possibility. One autumn evening, when Preston was in his early 50s and Sienna had just turned 50, they took a ride out to the place where he had found her all those years ago. The Snowdrift was long gone, replaced by golden grass waving in the breeze, but Preston remembered exactly where she had been lying. "Right there," he said, pointing. "You were half buried, holding that letter like it was the most precious thing in the world." Sienna dismounted and walked to the spot, running her hand through the grass. "I thought I was going to die. I was so cold I could not feel my feet anymore, and all I could think was how stupid I had been, how I had thrown away my life chasing a dream." Preston joined her, taking her hand. "But you did not die. I found you and we found each other, and look at everything that came from that moment." "You still have the letter?" Sienna asked suddenly. Preston smiled. "Of course I do. It is in my desk drawer, along with the first letter you wrote to the post office box and the response Carter sent. I kept them all." "Why?" "Because they are part of our story. Even the painful parts, the fraudulent parts. They brought us together, and I do not want to forget that." Preston pulled Sienna close, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Every time I look at those letters, I remember how lucky I am, how easily things could have gone differently." They stood like that as the sun set. Two people who had started as strangers brought together by chance and deception, who had chosen love over convenience and built something that would outlast them both. Their children would tell their grandchildren the story of how Preston found Sienna in a snowdrift and said he was the man she had been seeking, even though he had never invited her. How two lonely people had taken a cruel trick and transformed it into a love story for the ages. The years continued to pass, gentle and swift. Preston and Sienna grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their steps slowing but their love never diminishing. They watched James marry a sweet girl from town and start his own family. They celebrated Emma's success as a teacher and Grace's hard-won acceptance to medical school back east. When Preston was 65, he began gradually turning over the daily operation of the ranch to James, though he still rode out every day to check on things and offer advice. Sienna continued teaching until her 70s, finally retiring when her eyesight began to fail, and she could no longer read as easily. They spent their days together, sitting on the porch and watching their grandchildren play, telling stories of the old days and making plans for whatever time they had left. Preston made sure Sienna knew every single day how much he loved her, how grateful he was that fate had brought her to him in such a strange and unexpected way. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were dozens of people now, children and grandchildren and extended family, all connected by the love that Preston and Sienna had built from nothing. James stood up to make a toast. His own children gathered around him. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who proved that love does not always come in the way you expect, but when it comes, you hold on tight and never let go. Thank you for showing us what real partnership looks like, what real commitment means. Happy anniversary." Everyone drank and cheered, and Preston felt tears sting his eyes. He looked at Sienna, saw his own emotion reflected in her face, and squeezed her hand. "We did pretty well, did not we?" he whispered. "We did better than well," Sienna replied. "We did magnificently." That night, after everyone had gone home or settled into guest rooms, Preston and Sienna lay in bed together the way they had for 3 decades. Sienna's head rested on Preston's chest, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, their legs tangled together in the familiar comfort of long habit. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day after I woke up in Doc Henderson's office?" Sienna asked softly. "I said a lot of things that day. You said I was brave, that taking a chance on a better life took courage and there was no shame in that. Do you still think that?" Preston kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I think it every day. You were brave then, and you have been brave every day since. Brave enough to build a life with a stranger. Brave enough to love me even when I was difficult or stubborn. Brave enough to make this ranch a real home and raise our children to be good people. I am in awe of you, Sienna Irwin. I could not have done any of it without you. You saved me, Preston, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Preston corrected gently. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions of living but not really alive. You woke me up. You made me want to be better, do better. Everything good in my life came from you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two souls that had found each other against all odds and held on tight through everything life threw at them. Preston and Sienna lived to see their 40th anniversary, a miracle that they celebrated quietly with just their immediate family. By then, Preston's health was failing, his heart growing weaker with each passing year. But he remained stubbornly present, determined to spend every moment he could with the woman who had transformed his life. When Preston finally passed away at the age of 72, it was peacefully in his sleep with Sienna holding his hand. She was devastated but not broken, finding strength in their children and grandchildren and the legacy of love they had built together. Sienna lived another 5 years, spending her time with her family and keeping Preston's memory alive through the stories she told. She never remarried, saying that she had found her great love and one was enough for a lifetime. When Sienna's time finally came, she went peacefully in the same bed she had shared with Preston for so many years. Her last words were to James, who sat at her bedside holding her hand just as she had held his father's. "Tell them," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Tell your children and their children about how your father found me in a snowdrift, how he gave me a chance when he had no reason to, how we built all of this from nothing but determination and love. Tell them that true love is not about perfect circumstances or romantic gestures. It is about choosing someone every single day, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. I will, Mother. I promise." Sienna smiled and closed her eyes, and James could have sworn he saw his father's face in the shadows, reaching out to take her hand and lead her home. They buried Sienna next to Preston under a spreading oak tree on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. The whole town turned out for the funeral, testament to the impact she had made on so many lives. James and his sisters stood at the graveside, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, all of them connected by the love story that had started with a fraudulent letter and a snowdrift and a cowboy who had said he was the man she had been seeking. In the years that followed, the Irwin Ranch continued to thrive under James's management, and eventually under his son's management after that. The story of Preston and Sienna became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder of where they all came from and the values that had built their family. The letters that Preston had kept were preserved carefully, passed down through generations as precious heirlooms. Each new generation read them and marveled at how differently things could have turned out. how a cruel deception had been transformed into enduring love through the choices of two brave people. On the wall of the main house, which had been expanded and updated but never moved from its original location, hung a painting of Preston and Sienna done when they were in their 40s. In it, they stood together on the porch of their home, his arm around her shoulders and her hand over his on her waist, both of them looking at something beyond the frame with expressions of contentment and love. Beneath the painting was a small brass plaque that James had commissioned, inscribed with words that captured the essence of their story. She came seeking a promise. He offered a choice. Together they built a legacy that will endure for all time. And it did endure, through the generations that followed, through the changing times and the evolution of the West from wild frontier to settled civilization. The Irwin family remained rooted in Kansas, on the land that Preston had worked and Sienna had made into a home, their love story a foundation that could not be shaken. In the end, it did not matter that the letter had been a fraud. What mattered was that two people had looked at each other across impossible circumstances and said yes. Yes to possibility. Yes to partnership. Yes to love in all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality. Preston had found Sienna in a snowdrift holding a letter, and he had said he was the man she had been seeking. In doing so, he had spoken a truth deeper than either of them could have known at the time. He was exactly who she had been seeking, not the fictional character described in Carter's fraudulent advertisement, but the real man with his flaws and strengths and capacity for love. And she had been exactly what he needed, though he had not known he needed her until she appeared in his life like a gift from an unlikely source. Together, they had taken tragedy and deception and transformed it into something beautiful and lasting. Their story became a testament to the power of choice, to the courage it takes to build love rather than wait for it to magically appear fully formed. It showed that the best love stories are not about perfect meetings or ideal circumstances, but about imperfect people choosing to be perfect for each other. The West changed and evolved, but the story of Preston and Sienna Irwin remained constant, a bright thread running through the tapestry of their family's history. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled across the Kansas plains and snow began to fall, the Irwin descendants would gather around the fire and tell the story again. They would talk about the fraudulent letter and the snowdrift, about the cowboy who kept his promise even though he had never made it, about the woman who was brave enough to travel into the unknown seeking a better life. They would talk about how love can come from the strangest places if you are willing to be open to it. And they would remember that sometimes the greatest love stories start not with love at first sight, but with a choice to give love a chance to grow. Preston and Sienna had made that choice, and in doing so, they had created something that would live on long after they were gone, a legacy of love that would endure as long as there were Irwins to remember and honor it. The ranch still stood, generation after generation working the land and adding their own chapters to the family story. But it all traced back to that winter day in 1878 when Preston Irwin found a half-frozen woman in a snowdrift and decided that honor demanded he keep a promise he had never made. In that moment, though neither of them knew it yet, their real story had begun. Not the story written in Carter's fraudulent letter, but the true story of two people who built a life and a love that would become legendary in their family for generations to come. A story of courage and choice, of honor and determination, of taking what fate handed you and making something beautiful from it. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy Preston and Sienna Irwin left behind. Not just the land or the ranch or the material success they had achieved, but the knowledge that love, real love, is something you build with your hands and your heart, one choice at a time, one day at a time, until suddenly you look around and realize you have created something that will last forever.